I'm Anton, and I'm a climatalist. And chances are, you might be too. Climatalists sit at the intersection of business and nature. They want to play a key role in minimising the human-led impact on the environment, but they also understand the realities of living and working in a modern, capitalist world. Most importantly, they understand the central role that businesses can play in tackling the climate crisis. Ultimately, a climatalist believes that the future of profitable, good business can be equally profitable for the environment, but we've got a way to go before we get there. So if you too have pondered how we get to a future where clean, regenerative policy is embedded with profitable business models, the climatalist movement may just be for you. In this series, I'll be proving that climatalists are already out there leading the charge to marry their own good businesses with sustainable climate principles. Vaulta is a battery tech startup based in Brisbane, Australia. Their batteries, built locally in their hometown, are price competitive with offshore equivalents and are more durable and recyclable because of their modular design. Today, I'm interviewing Dominic Spooner, a designer turned CEO, about his journey and the difference he's hoping that Vaulta can make. Stay with us, and if you like the episode, please subscribe and follow Climatalist on all socials. Enjoy. Dominic, welcome to Climatalist.
Thanks, Anton. Thanks for having me.
Mate, you started your career as an industrial designer, and I know from past conversations that you're a musician. How do you go from those things to manufacturing batteries?
That's a really good question, Anton. I went from being a fairly poor musician and a reasonable industrial designer to becoming an okay CEO as well. Look, I think being on stage sets you up well for not having a fear of failure. There's nothing worse than stuffing up on stage royally, but once you actually do it a bunch of times, like I unfortunately did, you kind of work out that it's not such a big deal, and that failure is a learning, and you get better from that. Being an industrial designer, I think, carries a similar level of creativity. It's probably been core to my life and career throughout is a degree of creativity. I think it's just a problem-solving desire that puts people into industrial design. To become a CEO, look, it was a combination of creativity, a problem that I deemed big enough to solve that wasn't being solved by the people that I thought should be solving it. So that thrust me into the world of entrepreneurialism.
Yeah, wow. So that failure or that freedom to fail, how does that translate into the way that you operate Vaulta today?
Oh, look, I think not just through that being a failed or an amateur musician. I think removing the fear of failure, I think, gives you the capability to take some calculated risks and really focus on the outcome that you're looking to achieve. So, day to day, I'm always focused on what those outcomes can be rather than the objects. That's a mantra I had in one of my old businesses as an industrial designer, which was outcomes over objects, which is simply just what does the work that you're doing actually achieve rather than the nuts and bolts of what a product does. And I think that's something I've translated through basically everything I've tried.
So sort of starting with the end in mind almost.
Yeah, and I think I've started with the end in mind, definitely with Vaulta, and certainly used that during the design consultancy days as well, as to focus on what people are trying to achieve at the end, who is going to use it. The commonality across every industry is human beings. So ultimately, every decision you make should be about how it affects the people that you're trying to serve.
Amazing. Okay, so earlier in your career, you actually worked for another battery company. What did you learn there, and what happened to that business?
Yeah, earlier I worked for a locally based battery company. I learned a lot about designing batteries and just how batteries work. They didn't survive for a hell of a long time here, so that made my decision, or my next steps, a fairly straightforward decision. I didn't have the option to stay on. I didn't do any skunk works underneath that to set up what became Vaulta. I guess what it really helped me understand was that there was an energy transition that was going to take place sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. That was probably back in 2015, 2016. And the way that we consume energy was going to change. And that was, as a designer who is often thrust into a whole bunch of different industries at different times. You become a bit of a jack of all trades in different products and categories. I felt like I'd finally landed in something that I wanted to be a part of. So batteries kind of, I learned at that stage was where I wanted to be and where I could make an impact.
Awesome. And what's sexy about batteries? So what inspired you to go into battery tech specifically?
I think what's sexy about battery is just voltage and energy. I think what's sexy about batteries or renewable energy is obviously, a longer future for the people that come after us. I think that's pretty sexy. But I think what's really exciting about batteries in general is just where they can be used and how we use them. It's not just the voltage and the amp hours that's in a battery. That it just opens up a whole heap of different applications about how we might consume energy. And because we're, as a race, as a human race, starting to really question those use cases for energy, I think it gives us just a really open-ended dialogue about how we can use and purchase energy.
Yeah, it's interesting. So speaking of those applications, have you seen any really interesting movements around electrification where you think batteries play a big part?
Yeah, obviously mobility. I drive an EV myself. I think the home user is really has a lot of power in their hands about how we consume batteries and consume energy. I think the energy retailers will follow suit. The way that the grid is set up, both in locally and overseas, how the world transitions from coal-fired power or non-renewable energy to renewable energy. I think a really big tipping point is the consumer understanding the role that they have to play in that transition, and they don't have the red tape to go through. They don't have to go through a tender process to make that decision. They can make as consumer-based decision and an emotionally-based decision, and then they can make a research-based decision on whether they purchase or don't purchase a battery or solar or whatever their energy needs are. I think a really big tipping point is coming when the consumer can both see and afford what they need as far as energy goes.
I've heard recently in the venture scene in the climate space here in Sydney that very few venture funds will back a startup that's based around this concept of consumer preferences shifting. How does that interface with the market for your product? Oh, look, the venture market is probably not something I'm an expert enough to speak broadly on. We've had our own successes and challenges in getting funding in that venture space. Look, I think consumers are probably in the venture space are probably known to be fairly fickle or flip-floppy in their decision making and affected by a whole heap of things. It could be the cost of living which is driving a decision versus what sort of car their neighbour buys. So how accurate is your data and research analysis on your typical or ideal customer is probably a fair question on their part. And B2B sales probably makes it a lot easier to translate that into predictable revenue. Our main customer is usually a business anyway, but ultimately we have to cater to the consumer at every level. Let's pivot to Vaulta. So tell us about Vaulta. How did you go about founding it and building out your team?
Sure. Yeah. Vaulta's been around since, I believe, 2020. Founded as a thought bubble. Went through a brief accelerator program here just on the eve of COVID breakout. So, was able to cobble together some prototypes, which is, being a designer, I was able to do that essentially just in my own time. I had a design consultancy at the time called Ember Design House, and I essentially just treated myself as a client. My wife had just had a baby around the same sort of time, so I'd unlocked the other 12 hours of the day that people are usually asleep because I was awake a lot of that period as well, as was my wife.
Love the positive framing there.
Yeah, that's right.
Sleep deprivation, baby, new startup, the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a fantastic time to be alive, and I was awake to see most of it. So it was a really good period of the life. It's just, I used that period of time to really, I guess, tuck ourselves away and turn an idea into what could potentially be a company. I wasn't a serial entrepreneur, and I'm still not. So I had to learn a lot of that detail along the fly. And the easiest way for me to do that was to focus on design and a design solution that helps people. And I had a lot of learning to do with how to run a business and start a business. I didn't really know a hell of a lot about what a shareholders agreement or a constitution did. I didn't really have a share structure. I think I actually had to register the company to accept our first venture investment. So we didn't really have a company to accept that venture or a bank account for that matter. So, you could see how, I guess, seat of the pants it was in the early stages just because I was so focused on the design. I founded Vaulta mostly just because I considered battery-based to be a big enough problem to solve. And again, like I said before, I thought at the time that a lot of the bigger companies or the biggest players in the field weren't really doing enough about that. So if you take the end in mind at the first point is to say, well, where are these batteries going to end up? I don't think anyone had a suitable enough answer or a sophisticated enough answer to really justify the transition to renewables at that stage. And so working backwards from that, it was just a design phase. That 2020 period, we were basically locked away in a house. We rented part of a house to use as an office. I hired one employee, and we essentially just tucked ourselves away for about 12 months in R&D, just doing research. I hired a really good guy who knows a hell of a lot about batteries. And I learned a lot from him. He learned a lot from me about how to go about that design process. And we probably got to a stage where we had just enough of an MVP to sort of get to the next stage or the next round of funding. We went through some government grants. At the time, it was called Accelerating Commercialisation. That was part of the previous federal government's title, which doesn't exist anymore. I think it's called something else. But that sort of put us on, I guess, a little bit more of a bigger stage to talk to some other players. So we spoke to a few international companies. I found at that stage a lot of these companies were really open to having a Zoom meeting with just about anyone because it was, no one had anything to do. You didn't have to turn up for a meeting physically. So a lot of people were taking these really sort of loose meetings with us, just on the steps of their house because they could, or straight after the gym or whatever that was. And it was enough for us to have those early stage conversations, which really led us down the path of saying, well, what does a design solution look like? Are we designing something here that has a market? That was always the question that we needed to solve. Do we have something that can be commercialized? Just in the last 18 months, we've probably added maybe 6 or 7 new staff, really focused on that product development cycle, getting some sellable products, some Vaulta branded product commercialized and ready to go. And it's probably only in the last 6 to 8 months that's occurred.
Wow. And so early days, were you funding yourself? Did you keep the design consultancy going in the background, or did you just take the leap and jump in?
It's a little bit of a blur about what happened at that stage, Anton. When I say we, it was just me. Just say that to make it sound bigger than what it was, but it was all a bit mishmash at the time. Like I said, I generally treated myself as a client. So as a design consultancy or a design firm, I had sort of 8 working hours or billable hours in the day, but I had a whole bunch of other hours that I could utilize for my own purposes. And I think that was a good blend. I needed both. I had a mortgage. I had bills like everyone else, and I'd just been made redundant about a year before that. So I was growing this design consultancy at the same time. And it just so happened that when Vaulta started getting that interest, I probably finally just got traction with that design consultancy. So it was actually still quite an emotional decision to sort of take the jump about a year and a half after I'd sort of cobbled together the first ideas of what was Vaulta and actually make that a full-time role.
Wow. Okay. So there was some sanity, right? You were growing a design consultancy, which is incredible, at the same time as growing a battery or tinkering with a battery tech startup. What was the pivot point when you decided, okay, cool, I'm gonna a year and a half later, I'm gonna do it?
I think the pivot point to go full-time, Anton, was essentially a drive to continue to solve the problem that I'd identified. I think being a design consultant, I felt as if I was solving other people's design problems, which were just as important in their mind. And I just happened to have the skill set and the tools to focus in on the problem that I considered to be big enough. And just because the opportunity around renewable energy was such a significant one that I had a hunch that it was just the right space to be and the right space to put my energies. And to be perfectly honest, if none of it worked out, I could have just gone back to my design consultancy. So I considered it to be a little bit of a free swing, which sounds loose now, of course, but at the time I tried to use a really good analogy about what was the worst that can happen, and the result of what was the worst that could happen wasn't too bad. So I just had to take that risk and take that move, and had the support of friends and obviously the wife. She was really supportive, had a great steady job, which allowed me to stuff around with design for, the best part of the previous 10 years. So what's another 5, right?
Taking a punt. I mean, it's amazing, right? That this is how innovation happens. I do wonder, you mentioned that moment of hesitation before you took the leap. Was that your gut just saying go for it, or do you think it was you were ready to go for it and there was just a bit of fear kind of holding you back? Yeah,
probably the latter. I think I was ready to go for it. There was a bit of fear holding me back. There was reservations about being a new father and supporting the family. There was definitely reservations to have a full crack at that. But it's probably something I'm able to articulate now, but it wasn't a fear of failure that held me back. It was probably a drive of responsibility about whether this was the right thing to do, according to my family at the time, my family, about whether I should be doing that, whether I should be taking that plunge, knowing how much time and energy and focus that was going to take.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I did the same thing 12 years ago when we founded, when my family and I founded the last business, and I'm doing it again now, taking family money into a new business. And so I can definitely relate. There's that sense of responsibility and accountability that kind of like catches you here.
How often does it catch you, Anton, on a daily basis?
On a daily basis.
How many times per day?
But probably a couple of times per day at the moment. Being in launch mode is an interesting experience. Let's have a chat about, you're now in manufacturing mode, and we've heard a lot from politicians in the last couple of years, Labor in particular, that Australia needs to become a manufacturing nation. It hasn't been an easy road for a lot of manufacturers so far. What have been your challenges, and how are you kind of getting through them now?
We've faced challenges like any other manufacturing business. I think there's just the added element of being a startup, being in a relatively new technology, just added layers of complexity. Obviously, provides huge opportunity because the renewable energy field captures the imagination of a lot of people. It captures the interest, and certainly some of our earlier stage customers were really captivated by that storytelling element of what a purpose and why we're here. And it's probably something that's really become quite important as a company is having that purpose and maintaining that purpose. And, thinking about that any time that you have a weakness around a decision or, if it's a difficult day, is to maintain that purpose. I think manufacturing is just an overall challenging thing to do. It can be expensive. There's a high degree of complexity in manufacturing of fairly simple components. But the easiest way to approach it is in bite sizes. So, there's components that go into sub-assemblies and sub-assemblies that go into other sub-assemblies, and you can't design it all at once. So I think the challenge is to focus on the next step and the next step, and focus on scaling that, which is what we're doing. We can't skip 5 steps ahead. In manufacturing, you just have to undertake the next one that's in front of you, and that may be a mundane task, or it may be a really exciting, step change.
That's interesting. So walk me through a problem like that you've dealt with recently.
Yeah, I think it's about. Let me think of a problem we've had. So I would say a problem in battery management systems is something that we've had to overcome. A battery management system is essentially the brains of a battery, and really what makes it smart and tick and safe. So, when you're thinking about what sort of battery management system you want to implement, you have to have those categories or those mandates around safety and productivity, any sort of remote access and what you actually want it to do. And I think we're on to revision 5 of the battery management system, or it might even be 6, and we'll be doing another probably 1 to 2 iterations over the next 12 to 18 months. It's important to, I guess, recognise the step that you're at and say, well, we've learned something about this battery management system or this particular design problem. How we've found out about it can sometimes really suck, but it's about understanding, the learning that you can get out of that and how you can iterate and get that design better. At the end of the bill of materials, I guess, is just a list of components, and we've designed pretty well all of them. We use suppliers to make most of them, and then we assemble and test them. So if it feels complex, it's important to just take a step back and just focus on just step-by-step procedures.
Let's double click on a couple of bits there. So finding out not a good way, like what's happened I used to get support tickets, the worst support tickets in the world. What happens in your context?
The worst thing that can happen with a battery management system, at least in our world, we haven't had catastrophic incidents. It'll just be a blown BMS. It'll be a bug in the software that causes it to just do something completely the opposite of what you want it to do. The issue with that is it might be in a customer's hands, and they'll tell you about that problem. They may tell you in lots of different ways, but in general, the next thing you need to do is just focus on solving that issue. The base level of what we had was always pretty good, pretty safe, but it was important for us to just understand where we were at in the product cycle, that, we're on maybe generation 1, generation 2 of that battery management system, and we weren't. I should have known this. I have known this. I told people this for a living as an industrial designer, that you prototype, say, 3-4 times before you get to a fully commercialized level. What you also need to understand is once you're commercialized, you're still making iterations. You're still focusing on development. You're still looking at those, small changes that can help the customer or can make production easier, cheaper, more efficient.
Okay. I'm keen to understand more about battery management system, but let's step back a bit and say, so my view on what a battery is still rooted in the Energizer Bunny and double A's from when I was a kid. What's the difference between those and the kind of batteries that you're talking about, which I understand are for commercial purposes or maybe large homes?
Yeah, the batteries we use, Anton, are a chemistry called lithium iron phosphate. So it's not dramatically different from what you're talking about. In your old Energizer Bunny days, there's still a positive and a negative terminal. For a cylindrical cell, it still has a top and a bottom, which will be a plus and a minus. So all of those aspects are very similar. But I guess over the years, things have morphed into different package sizes or different package types. So we use a prismatic cell, which is essentially just a rectangular prism, has the positive and the negative terminals on the top. But inside of that lithium ion family, there's a bunch of different, I guess, subcategories. And the one that we use is lithium iron phosphate. We selected that because it has pretty good energy density, is quite robust as far as life cycle goes, can be beaten up a bit as far as, temperature and voltage and C rates. So C rates is basically how fast you drain the battery. And then isn't quite as explosive as some of the other battery chemistries as what you say.
Explosive not being a good thing. So let's just break that down. So the chemistry of the battery affects how long it holds charge, the amount of charge that it holds, how many times you can charge it, and how volatile it might be in any given application.
Yeah, the chemistry is going to have a large role to play in your application. So even there's another one that's probably in there that I'm not quite as much of an expert on as our R&D engineer, but how it discharges has a curve cycle as well. So with lithium iron phosphate, you can picture it. It basically discharges right at the start, goes flat for essentially 85% of its cycle, and then it just drops off a cliff for that charge cycle. And that's good, but I guess the challenge that presents is for this whole sort of middle flat discharge cycle, you actually don't always know exactly what percentage or how full the battery is, which can present issues if your battery management system can't deal with what sort of different levels of charge those different cells have got.
So the battery management system is taking a bunch of these cells and running them based on the demand that the battery is under. Is that a good way of explaining it?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think there's kilowatt hours, which is basically how much water you have in the jug, and then kilowatts is basically how fast you empty or fill the jug. And we have 16 cells in series, which means you take a 3.2 volt cell, put that in series. So 16 of those is 51.2 volts. If you put them in parallel, the voltage stays the same, capacity goes up.
Yeah, got it. So transformers come together, and then you get not the technical transformers, the cartoon version come together. You get all of these batteries, and then you get a super battery, which is basically what we're talking about in a car or at a utility scale. But
yeah, broadly speaking, there's always different interfaces, contactors. There's other components that go into it, but broadly speaking, you're talking about cells put together in series, and then a battery management system managing those cells.
Yeah, interesting. So when we hear in the news, battery life cycles might be 3 times longer based on this R&D breakthrough, are they talking about battery chemistry?
Often. They may be talking about a composition of a chemistry. They may be talking about a different package type or a charging capability. There's a little bit of snake oil in battery chemistry marketing, because you can, I guess, push and pull results about what you actually want to present. So you may, have a faster charge cycle depending on how big the battery cell is. So there's a little bit of grain and salt in some of these technology breakthroughs that you have to read through. But overall, charge cycle, how long it lasts, how fast you can discharge it, because heat is basically the enemy of the battery. So a lot of that will have to do with thermal management and how much heat it produces. And then just different types of materials that it might use. So, cobalt, for example, is a fairly sensitive material. How it's sourced worldwide is sometimes a precarious topic. It's also something that might contribute to a cell being a little bit more explosive than some of the other families. So, yeah, there's a bit of a process of trying to eradicate some of those less than ideal materials from battery chemistries. And that's been happening for the last 10 years and will continue to happen at a rapid rate over the next 10 years. I guess one of the things that Vaulta, or myself being Vaulta in the early stages, recognized was the cell chemistry was moving rapidly. The technology advancements in cell chemistry was just advancing almost overnight. But the way that cells were packaged and turned from a cell into a module, into a pack, or into a product just wasn't really keeping up. So, the focus was on performance or cost, weight or dischargeable capability, but it wasn't necessarily on, are we actually solving the original problem, which was sustainability? And with a whole bunch of batteries, it's not necessarily that they were going into landfill, but for whatever reason, about 95% of them weren't being recycled. And I just considered that to be such a counterproductive argument to why we were transitioning to batteries in the first place.
So tell me about that. I mean, I think that's at the heart of Vaulta. So what is Vaulta's tech? What makes it different to other battery providers?
Yeah, what makes Vaulta different is we focused in on how a battery is packaged. So we're not a cell manufacturer. We're not a chemistry focused company when it comes to batteries. We're a buyer of battery cells. So we look for the best chemistries and the best, whatever the application requires is a selection process, not a design process. What happens at that point is you need to turn a cell into a module, into a pack, whether it's 16 cells or 1 or 5. Whatever you need to do, that's where we come in. So we've designed a cell casing or cell housing system that allows for an easy assembly process, but then also an easy disassembly process. And that gives us a couple of advantages, is that the easy assembly process has helped us to scale our manufacturing capability without huge CapEx. So rather than needing millions of dollars of equipment to set up a battery assembly line, we do that for a fraction of the cost. It's a pilot assembly line, so it will continue to incur cost and CapEx. But for us to go from 0 to 1 was much easier with our design. And then the disassembly side allows you to create different opportunities for what happens in the event of a cell failure or an end-of-life scenario. So you might have a battery that fails in the field. It could be a single cell. So what you might do is either replace that cell, provided it's of a similar sort of life capacity, or you may replace that entire pack with a new one and then bring back the other cells. You only have to recycle or deal with the end of life for, say, 1 instead of 16 cells. And you can create a refurbished battery pack and put it out as a second life opportunity. So if you take the broad assumption that all batteries can and should and eventually will be recycled, that's not the case at the moment. It's about 90% are not. But if you take the broad assumption that they can and will and should eventually, but then there's all these other opportunities in the middle before that takes place. So dangerous goods has a really large role to play in that. You know, if you've got a 100 kilo battery that fails, then you've got 100 kilos of dangerous goods, even if it's only a single cell or even a battery management system. If you can repair the battery management system, the cable harness, or the cell, then you might reduce down to, say, 5 kilos of dangerous goods freight, which just greatly reduces the cost, of course, and increases the likelihood that that recycling or that dangerous goods freight to a recycling facility is going to take place.
That's incredible. So modularity drives incremental manufacture, it drives repairability, and presumably circularity as well, right? So a big thing that we've spoken about and that Vaulta mentions is this concept around recycling and circularity. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Circularity is core to what we do, I believe, Anton, and I think it's over time that we've been able to double down on that approach. We had a bit of a hunch or a bit of a bet that being able to disassemble a battery can create its own new opportunities for batteries should there be a cell failure or a failure or end of life event. But I believe what we do can create a whole heap of other industries. So when you talk about sustainability, you don't just talk about energy or energy management. You talk about circularity and sustainability of an entire market to say, well, can we even help other companies get started by having a batch or an inventory of these kind of used cells that I was talking about? I don't have all of the answers for these things, but I believe, and nor do I have the staff to service every market that's available. But bite sizes, like I said before. But in the short term, can we create new markets with second life batteries by saying, well, we start with the most rigorous applications? It might be grid scale storage, it might be electric vehicles. Can they then be used in microgrid or off-grid applications or backup systems? And you basically tier down the needs of that battery based on, I guess, the life that it's lived.
So extending the life of a cell or a module in a battery all the way through the chain.
If it's not manufacture, use, kill, it's manufacture, use, kill, recycle.
Got it. So let's think ideal customer. Who do you sell to today? If you sell to customers today, what does the customer look like?
Our ideal customer at the consumer level is often an off-gridder. They'll be a homeowner or multiple homeowner. They will have a focus on sustainability. Chances are they've come across us because they're researching things around batteries and what asset they need to run their off-grid property. They're often not our direct customer. They will be the end customer. The person who we invoice is usually an electrical contractor or an installer. And how we reach those people is just through typical marketing channels, and how we, I guess, appeal to them is with fairly simple business metrics, which is, can the products be profitable for the installer, both at a product level and in installation level? Does it work all the time, every time, like it should? And then if it doesn't, are you there to take that call and support? Because if you're not, you don't really have a business.
So service forms a really big part of what of your go-to-market.
Yeah, service is a massive part of it, and after sales and support are really big elements of what's going to cause us to win in this industry, or any industry for that matter. I think it's pretty common to any industry that you need to have a great pre-sales, sales, and then after-sales experience, because there's a lot of options available. Perhaps even the performance of those products is not as good, but if they're there to take a call, if they're there to support you when you need that, well, then you may veer towards that because it just gives you a certain level of security. I think the barrier for entry is if you assume that some batteries have to fail or there will be failures in the field, that's pretty typical of any sort of newish technology, is that there's going to be changes or failures or learnings. And it's how you deal with those that as a company to the customer and show that support to that customer that really matters, I believe.
And so you mentioned installers. Are you going direct to some of the bigger commercial outlets? Are you working through electricians? Or are you B2B?
At the moment, it's B2B. It's basically straight to the installer. That's not necessarily the plan long term. We did start out with some direct-to-consumer sales because you need to build the demand in that consumer space. They were the first people that were captivated by, I guess, the story and how the business could, be different to other battery companies. So I think once you've got that captivated audience, the next natural thing to do is to make some initial sales direct to that market, basically make the installation happen for them so that it's a fairly streamlined process. And then you show that it works. You've got the runs on the board, and then you build that network of installers to say, hey guys, this product works. We've sold it to a whole bunch of consumers. They're happy to say great things about what we're doing and how we made their experience in installation. Is this something that you could get around and inquire about? There's basic simple training, it's product sales. It's a really important story about battery based and how we can solve that problem with this product or with this product range or with this design mentality. And I think once the installers have that message on board, it makes it fairly easy for them to have some traction as well. Still early stages, but we'd likely end up with some wholesalers at some point.
Are you competitive versus, say, a Chinese counterpart coming in or a Tesla Powerwall? Particularly given that you're manufacturing locally? We
are price competitive. There's a number of, I guess, more well-known companies that we can be price competitive with. I'd be lying if I said we were taking their market share right now. It's obviously still early stages, but what makes us price competitive and still Australian-made is bringing as much of that design capability in-house as possible, and that's obviously an advantage of Vaulta, is that the top-down approach is that there's design right throughout the business. So having that focus on design and capability means that, it de-risks a lot of things for our local suppliers if we're only asking our sheet metal manufacturer to just make sheet metal parts rather than, to a specific, other need of where they're putting things together for us, because we're doing the assembly in-house, that we're just asking them to make sheet metal parts according to a design. So, and if we do that locally, then freight's reduced because you've got, lower weight products. Chances are you've got higher quality outcomes with the actual parts that are made as well. So I guess being able to bring a lot of that design in-house is how we stay price competitive. So yes, I think we are. There's definitely products that are cheaper than ours. But, long term, I think we've got a really good capability to be price competitive long term.
Wow. So there's a bunch of writing, specifically Elon Musk. I'm an Elon Musk fangirl, and he talks about connecting or keeping product and business and design right next to the manufacturing process, literally sitting them next to each other. And you're embedding that in the business.
Yeah, we are implementing a design from the top-down approach. I wasn't aware of the quote or the direct connection to Tesla, but or Elon Musk for that matter. But I think we've been through obviously enough research and development phases to understand that we win by being excellent at making great product, and to get to great product, you have to be as close to the design as you possibly can be.
A patent protection, IP, it sounds like the modularity piece is a really critical part of what makes you different in the marketplace. Are you worried about copycats?
Of course, yeah. We'll forever be dealing with copycats. It's the perpetual issue with making hardware. What I would say is we're pretty smart people, and it took us quite a while. So if you wanted to come after that and try and replicate that, you would also need a whole bunch of smart people with a lot of time on their hands to replicate that. But I think the more we grow, the more we focus on that support for customers and giving great service and great product and being reliable, those sorts of IP infiltration issues just sort of start to fade away and focus on the brand. Vaulta should be known as that circular battery option. And I think people will be happy to come to that directly rather than look for alternatives in that space if we do our job correctly. IP is always going to be a big thing. We use a great IP firm and have spent a whole truckload of money with them doing that and taking their advice on board basically for the last 3 to 4 years. It's a huge percentage of what our expenditure is across the lifetime of the business. So you have to take that seriously and take that advice on board. But it's not something that you can sit there and fear, because what you need to focus on is actually being the best at what you do rather than focus on people coming up and copying you, because you can't patent great service.
Got it. Before we leave the technical side, modularity has not been a big feature of most of the EV movement or the electrification movement over the last decade. Why do you think that is? Why are we welding our batteries together?
We weld batteries predominantly in this market because there is a performance metric that comes out of that. Obviously, you reduce the impedance, you reduce the contact resistance of battery connections, and that's a fact.
So what does that mean, just for people like me who don't understand?
Contact resistance equates to heat generally. If you've got a poor contact between those metals, then chances are you'll create a lag. If the current is still coming from the cell but it has a poor connection, it's basically like a traffic jam, and that the traffic jam comes in the form of heat. So if that happens too much, well then you might cause a fire, but you might just cause it to degrade faster. You might not get the full voltage capacity out of a battery, and we've been through a huge amount of those trials, particularly with cylindrical cells. So getting the right contact is really important. The reason why I think people have focused on that is because it delivers performance. The biggest drivers in the market have been range, like how far can I drive this car? That's the big performance metric in renewables at the moment, is how long do I have? How many days do I have? How fast can I go? And that's basically come at the expense of everything. It's probably a pretty typical focus for an earlier stage technology, is to say, what can we actually get out of this technology before we focus on, the true supply chain and circularity of the entire industry. I'm sure people did a whole bunch of this in other industries about how much power you can pack into a phone or pack into a computer before you actually work backwards and say, what does the customer actually need right now? Because it's really important for us to understand what the end looks like, not just what happens during the current life.
It's pretty interesting. I mean, Europe's just launched or it's just legislated a right to repair, which kicks in the next couple of years. It'll be interesting to see. And that's an interesting point to pivot. So European markets, US market, and the Inflation Reduction Act, given the opportunity and some of the stuff around right to repair, and the fact that the industry is sort of run at performance and now might be sitting back and starting to think, okay, what do we do about this problem? Why not, tackle those massive markets? Why start here, or why focus here?
Why focus here? I believe Queensland and Australia have almost unicorn conditions for the uptake of renewables. So it's a really good test bed for the rest of the market. I think, it's a relatively small market share globally, but Queensland has a really high uptake for solar. So does Adelaide and South Australia broadly. New South Wales and Victoria are catching up. We have really good conditions to capture the sun's energy over and over again, predictably. And we also have reducing feed-in tariffs, which means a lot of that energy needs to go somewhere. So the opportunity is here to do that. There's a huge focus on residential storage. A lot more people in Australia live in homes or live in actual standalone dwellings.
So just before, can I interrupt? Just reducing feed-in tariffs for the people that don't understand what that means. Can you double click on that for me?
Yeah, sure. Feed-in tariffs is essentially if you put solar on your roof and then you don't use that solar on demand, or basically as it comes through, it will feed back to the grid. And when solar first came on, some of those prices were quite high. I'm not totally sure exactly how high they were, but let's just say broadly speaking, they may have been above 20 cents per kilowatt at that given time. And some of them have been reduced right down to sort of 3-5 cents, meaning your roof is not making as much money as it used to. Therefore, it makes more sense to capture that energy when you're not using it and use it when you need to or want to use it, which is where a battery would come in.
I understand.
And then there's a whole heap of other applications outside of just that solar, is that you might say, well, for the people on EV retail plans, that there'll be different periods of the day that energy may be free or lower cost. So you may choose those periods to just charge the battery, and that may have nothing to do with solar, and then use that during other parts of the day, or during that nighttime period where there might be peaks.
So electricity price arbitrage.
Yeah, virtual power plant is the broad term that people are using. Turning your home into a power plant is roughly the topic of how that would be sort of explained to the layman.
But still, 24 million or 25 million, whatever the population number is, 360 million, 500 million in Europe. We won't talk about China because it's a whole different ballgame. It's a different scale of opportunity.
Yeah, look, the opportunity is huge in America, Europe, of course. And there's obviously drivers towards that. The Inflation Reduction Act is a really good example of how that can showcase local product. I just still think that we need to get best at what we do locally before we consider that. There's product opportunities, there's product updates that we will continue to make before we really seriously take the plunge to go overseas. There is a captivated market here, and if you don't have everything resolved here, then why on earth would you think you're going to have it resolved over there in a magnitude of scale? It requires just a huge amount of effort to do that. So it's not something I would take lightly. It's absolutely the ambition of the company, but it would be foolish for me to just jump on a plane and try and take Vaulta global right now when we have a market that we need to serve and a market share that we need to penetrate here. There's ample opportunity for us to do that here first before we really think about what happens overseas. Absolutely want to do it, but it's just you need to think about where your resources are best used at the moment.
Got it. So on that point then, we've talked about funding rounds early on in the piece. In our previous conversation, you talked about potentially raising more funds. How much does that funds flow contribute to your growth versus actual sales revenue? So what's revenue? What's external funding?
Oh, look, we're absolutely still reliant on external funding. So that can come from a number of different places. It's usually in the form of equity-based funding. It can also be matched grant funding. The R&D tax credit is also, heavily used on our side for product development. We produce a tremendous number of prototypes. Some of them work, some of them fail spectacularly. That's exactly what that R&D claim allows you to do. It allows you to take the plunge in prototyping to get things right. So I think that's a really important funding step for most companies to take, is to focus on what is R&D and what is just core, product advancement, because you really need to understand the difference between the two. But I'd say revenue is starting to catch up. We've had probably our best quarter, and out of the quarter, I think the quarter that we just had, it's probably better as that quarter as the previous 3 quarters combined. So I think there's an inflection point that we're at the moment, but we're not sure about what the zoom level is on that inflection point, about whether we're, just right at the start of that inflection point, whether we're seeing we don't know the exact taper of that inflection point, but, we know that we're on the right track as far as revenue goes. We've got the right customers. We're getting the right sort of feedback about the sort of projects that we're winning over some of our competitors, and some of those competitors are much bigger companies than ours, and we're winning because of the reasons that matter to us, which is we chose your product because of circularity. We chose your product because you guys answered the phone when we called. We chose your product because it's reliable in the field. We've installed it and we've seen it working, and now we're comfortable to use it more. So the revenue is catching up and will catch up, but we've got a little bit of time to go yet. So we'll continue to do equity-based funding for the time being.
What is your growth ambition? So if we go forward, say, a year, 2 years, 5 years, what does the company look like at those stages versus where it is now?
Where does the company sit in 5 years? I believe we can be the biggest battery manufacturer in the country, which may not be reaching for the stars, but I believe we can do that in less than 5 years. And then we need to focus on that global market because we have to. I think, what's the point in going small? You and I have spoken about this offline in other times, Anton, about you have to have that huge ambition to take something to major scale, because what's the point if you don't? We've been entrusted with, a good product, and we've got the right tools and the right people to take that to the world. So, we need to move that as fast as we possibly can and have those ambitions to go truly global.
What's the total addressable market for this product, do you think, in 5 years in Australia?
Total addressable market in 5 years, we think, is going to be north of several $1 billion. I think it's already about $1 billion market, the residential space, specifically in Australia, at the growth rate that it's heading towards. You'd see at least a 5 to 10-fold growth trajectory for just residential space. I think the off-grid space is growing as well. It's a little bit harder to capture that data about the people that might be moving away from the city into those off-grid zones. I think the uptake of commercial batteries probably hasn't had enough traction yet for us to really understand the opportunity of the market. I mean, if you go down those total addressable markets of lithium batteries broadly, it's just a ludicrous number. But, we bring ours right down to serviceable, obtainable market of about $3 to $4 billion just in Asia Pacific at the moment for the areas that we work. And that's around 20 to 200 kilowatt hours is our sweet spot there. And we think that market's somewhere around $3 to $4 billion just in Asia Pacific only.
And those are small industrial and large homes or off-gridders in that vector.
Yeah, that's right. Our key market at the moment is large resi into smaller, medium scale commercial opportunities. We're not in the smaller scale residential. We do residential, sort of 14 kilowatt hours, but we rarely go below that. And more often we end up, say, 28, 45 kilowatt hours. We just did one last week, which was 85 kilowatt hours for an off-grid home. So that's the sort of perfect spot for us at the moment.
So that, just for perspective, that 85 kilowatt hours, how many bedrooms, how many people in the house, like what are they using that 85 kilowatts for?
85 kilowatt hours is probably a large family home with high power needs. So there could be a slightly agricultural element to what they're doing. Certainly the case for this one that we're doing at the moment. But there's also, a high degree of reliance, in these particular sectors. I don't believe this particular property needs 85 kilowatt hours, but there's a desire to have multiple days of resilient power should there be, some bad weather through the solar. If the place gets cut off through inclement weather, then, there's a great opportunity to use that battery power for days on end.
So let's it's been incredible hearing about the business. Let's sort of try and close out. And I ask a question typically when I get to the end of these podcasts, and that is, outside of what you're doing, what you're focused on, what is one really big opportunity that you think business, whether it's climate-focused business or not, is leaving on the table in the climate space?
I think there's a really big opportunity in leasing of assets. I don't want to give away my hand here, but I guess one of the big changes that I think will come to the renewable energy space, or even the energy space full stop, is just leasing of assets for periods of time. I think over time you may see less people purchasing this equipment, renting it, providing that it offsets their energy costs. As the consumer, whatever that might look like, it could be a residential space, could be commercial business. I think they'll get more and more clear on what their energy needs are, and they will pull in energy creating assets as it suits them, rather than just purchasing these things outright. So I think there's a really big opportunity for the market to dip into that a little bit more. In the short term, I'm not sure if it's truly got traction, but I think in the long term, if you take a broad assumption that people need power they have a view that the technology is moving fast and that they may not want to purchase that equipment because the technology is moving faster than their purchasing cycle.
So the take would be, things are moving quickly, and you want to be able to hot swap stuff as it's relevant. It strikes me. I read recently a company in Israel that was doing something in the irrigation space, and farmers were skeptical as to whether or not they should purchase this product. And the company went to the point of installing it for free and effectively partnering with the farmer on the yield improvement for that farm as a result of the installation of the tech. They were that comfortable in backing the technology. Is that sort of the realm that you're thinking about, or specifically to deal with the challenge of technology movement?
No, I think so. I think if you have the runs on the board as a company and you know how your product's being used, which, to be fair, you can get that through a battery management system, and you can start to capture that sort of information and work out what's important to make those sorts of decisions and help people make those decisions about what sort of energy assets they need. I think it's really it's a really open-ended dialogue about how you can give that customer the right thing that they need at the right time, whether that's leasing, whether that's small-scale purchasing, whether that's buying into an entire ecosystem of batteries or solar or whatever those assets might be, 10, 20 years from now. I think it's a really big opportunity for businesses to understand just what their bloody customer needs, to be honest.
Makes a ton of sense. Final question. So you're on the journey, you've been on the journey for 4 years and some time before that in your design consultancy. What advice would you give a founder starting up in the energy or climate tech sector?
I would give the advice to another climate tech founder. I'll focus just on climate tech. Focus on the market first. I think over time we've learned that we probably could have done that a little bit better at the start. And certainly the coaching that I've had throughout that process. Find a great advisor and have a thick skin and let them really tell you what you need to know, because chances are someone's been through something similar. So you should really just ask, because the advice that you can get out there, and I've found it really, really helpful and overwhelming at times, just how much people are willing to give you their time for this particular problem, which is the climate. So seek help and don't be shy, because it's amazing the people that will give you their time, and I'm just hugely appreciative to the people that have given me their time.
You sound very clear, though. It's interesting. I think lots of people will give you lots of advice, and advice is easy when you're not in the seat. And it strikes me from our conversation that you're very, very clear around where you're going. Do you think that's a product of the advice that you've had, or you think it's a product of you kind of coming to where you want to take this business?
No, I think it's learned. I think my natural personality is to just jump straight in, whereas it's probably something I've learned over time is to, what's the term that's been used to me? If he ends up listening to this podcast, measure twice, cut once is the advice I would say, which is funny because my dad's been telling me that for 40 years. I just didn't listen to him.
There's another one a mentor of mine gave me, which talks to the market point, which is talk is cheap, but whiskey costs money.
It might be the same guy.
Yeah. Well, look, that's a great place for us to finish up. Dominic, thank you so much for giving us your time. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thanks, Anton. Thanks for having me, mate.
Once again, if you like listening today, then please subscribe to The Climatalist wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a follow on Instagram, where we're just Climatalist. I'm Anton. Thanks for listening.